The first time I saw Patricia Whitman crouched behind my rose bushes with a measuring tape and clipboard, I thought maybe she was having some kind of medical episode. It was 7:30 on a Tuesday morning in July, the Phoenix sun already promising another day over 100 degrees. And there she was in her crisp white polo shirt and khaki shorts, literally on her hands and knees in my front yard. "Excuse me," I called out from my front door, coffee mug in hand. "Can I help you with something?" She looked up without the slightest trace of embarrassment, her silver hair still perfectly styled, despite her contortionist routine in my landscaping. "Good morning, David. I'm conducting measurements for compliance verification." "Compliance with what exactly?" Patricia stood up, brushing mulch off her knees with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd clearly done this before. "Your rose bushes appear to exceed the allowable height for front yard plantings, as specified in Section 4.2C of our community guidelines." I set my coffee down on the porch railing and walked closer, noting how she'd positioned herself well inside my property line. "Patricia, those roses have been there for 6 years, since before I even moved in." "That's unfortunate, but grandfather clauses don't apply to clear violations." She made a note on her clipboard. "Current height measures 34 inches. Maximum allowable is 30 inches. 4 inches. I'm sorry, you're saying my roses are 4 inches too tall?" "Correct. You'll need to trim them to compliance or face progressive fining starting at $200. I stared at her, waiting for some indication that she was joking. Patricia Whitman had been elected HOA president 8 months ago on a platform of restoring neighborhood standards, which apparently translated to prowling around people's yards with measuring equipment at dawn. "Patricia, these are David Austin roses. You can't just hack them down to 30 inches. That would kill them." "Then I suggest you replace them with compliant plantings." She clicked her pen and made another note. "You have 14 days to remedy the violation. The notice will be posted to your account this afternoon." "Posted to my account? What account?" "We've transitioned to a digital violation tracking system, much more efficient. You should have received the registration email last month." I hadn't. But then again, I'd been getting so many emails from the HOA lately that I'd started automatically deleting anything with Willowbrook Estates in the subject line. "I never agreed to any digital tracking system. Homeowner consent isn't required for administrative improvements." Patricia consulted her clipboard again. "While I'm here, I should mention that your garbage bins were visible from the street for approximately 47 minutes past the 7 a.m. collection deadline last Thursday." "How do you know it was 47 minutes? I maintain detailed logs of neighborhood compliance issues." The coffee in my stomach turned acidic. "You're watching my house. I'm ensuring community standards are maintained for everyone's benefit." She smiled, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Have a wonderful day, David." I watched her walk away, her white tennis shoes squeaking slightly on the sidewalk, and felt something shift in my chest. It wasn't anger exactly, more like the recognition that a line had been crossed and there was no going back. That evening, I called my neighbor Jake Martinez, who lived 3 houses down and worked as a paralegal downtown. I'd helped him move his couch when he'd first bought the place 2 years ago, and we'd bonded over our shared bewilderment at some of Patricia's previous initiatives. "She was in your yard measuring roses." Jake laughed, but it had a bitter edge. "Dude, she's been escalating. Last week she cited Mrs. Chen for having her newspaper delivery bag hanging on her mailbox post for more than 24 hours. That's insane." "Gets better. The bag was there because Mrs. Chen fell and broke her hip. She's been in the hospital for 3 days. I sank into my kitchen chair, suddenly feeling older than my 42 years. "How is this legal?" "Technically, she's probably operating within the HOA covenants we all signed when we bought our houses. The devil's in the details, and Patricia's really good at finding details. But measuring people's plants, timing garbage collection... Look, I've been reading up on this stuff because of my job. HOA boards have pretty broad authority to interpret and enforce community standards. The problem is when you get someone like Patricia who treats it like a personal fiefdom." "So what can we do?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, Not much, unless she does something that crosses into actual legal territory. Harassment, trespassing exceeding her authority under state law. But 4-inch roses and garbage bin timing, that's all probably covered under the covenants. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time listening to the hum of the air conditioning and thinking about the roses. My ex-wife Sarah had planted them the first spring after we'd bought the house. She'd spent hours researching varieties that would thrive in Arizona heat, finally settling on the David Austins because they were supposed to be particularly hardy. The irony of their name didn't escape me now. Sarah and I had divorced 3 years ago, but she'd specifically asked if I'd keep the roses when we divided up our belongings. They were the first thing that made this place feel like home, she'd said. I'd promised I would. Now, Patricia Whitman wanted me to destroy them over 4 inches. I opened my laptop and typed Willowbrook Estates HOA digital portal into the search bar. It took me to a professionally designed website with a cheerful banner photo of our neighborhood entrance sign surrounded by purple bougainvillea. The login page required a username and password I'd never set up. I clicked Forgot Password and entered my email address. Within minutes, I had a temporary password and access to something called my Homeowner Compliance Dashboard. The interface was sleek and modern with colorful charts tracking community wellness metrics and standards adherence trends. My personal dashboard showed 3 active violations: the roses, the garbage bins, and something called unauthorized vehicle display. I clicked on the vehicle violation and felt my blood pressure spike. According to the system, my 2019 Honda Civic had been parked facing the wrong direction on my own driveway for 6 hours last Saturday. The violation notice included time-stamped photos taken from the street. I scrolled down to see who had reported it. The entry showed verified by P. Whitman, HOA President. Documentation, photo surveillance, GPS, timestamp, verification. GPS timestamp verification. She was documenting the exact times of my supposed violations. I closed the laptop and poured myself a beer, trying to process what I'd just seen. In the span of 1 week, Patricia had measured my plants, monitored my garbage collection, and photographed my car, all while maintaining that she was simply ensuring community standards. The next morning, I decided to test something. I parked my car facing the street instead of my house, left my garbage bins out an extra 15 minutes, and made sure to be visible working in my garden. Sure enough, at 8:15 a.m., I spotted Patricia walking past my house. She slowed down, took out her phone, and snapped a photo of my car. Then she crouched down near my mailbox and appeared to be measuring the distance between my driveway and the property line. "Good morning, Patricia," I called out. She straightened up quickly, but didn't seem embarrassed. "Good morning, David. I see you've corrected the vehicle positioning violation. I didn't realize there was a specific direction I was supposed to park in my own driveway. Vehicles should face the street for optimal traffic flow and visual aesthetics. It's clearly stated in the community guidelines." "Which section?" Section 6.1a through D covers vehicle placement, appearance, and duration standards. I walked closer, noting that she was holding what looked like a small digital measuring device. "What are you measuring now?" "Your mailbox appears to be potentially out of compliance with Postal Service setback requirements. The Postal Service has been delivering my mail to that box for 6 years without complaint. That doesn't negate HOA responsibility to ensure proper positioning." She made a note in her phone. "I'll need to complete the measurement process." "Patricia, I need to ask you something directly. Are you surveilling my house?" "I'm conducting routine compliance monitoring for the benefit of the entire community." "That's not what I asked." "I'm not sure what you're implying, David." "I'm asking if you're watching my house, taking photos, and documenting my activities." Patricia clicked off her measuring device and looked at me with the expression of a teacher explaining something obvious to a slow student. "As HOA president, I have both the authority and the responsibility to ensure community standards are maintained. That includes documentation of violations and verification of compliance." "How often are you documenting my property?" "As often as necessary." "Which is how often?" "I don't see how that's relevant to your compliance obligations." A car pulled up across the street and my neighbor Sandra Kim got out, clearly heading to work. She waved at me, then noticed Patricia with her equipment and slowed down. "Everything okay, David?" Sandra called out. "Just discussing mailbox positioning," I said, not taking my eyes off Patricia. Sandra walked over, still in her nurse scrubs from the night shift. "Mailbox positioning. The HOA is ensuring all community fixtures meet current standards," Patricia said smoothly. Sandra looked confused. "David's mailbox has been there forever. The mail carrier has never mentioned any problems." "Postal Service delivery and HOA compliance are separate issues," Patricia replied. "HOA standards may be more stringent than federal postal requirements." "More stringent how?" "Specific setback distances, height requirements, aesthetic consistency standards." Sandra looked at me, then back at Patricia. "You're measuring David's mailbox to see if it's the right distance from his driveway. Among other compliance factors, yes. Patricia, with all due respect, don't you think there are more important things for the HOA to focus on, like the broken streetlight on Maple Drive that's been out for 3 months? Patricia's smile became noticeably thinner. "All community issues are important, Sandra. That's why we have systematic compliance monitoring." "Systematic compliance monitoring," Sandra repeated slowly. "Is that what we're calling it?" "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean taking pictures of people's houses and timing their garbage collection." Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly. "I take documentation photos only when necessary to verify violations. And I don't time garbage collection, I simply note when bins remain visible beyond the permitted time frame." "How long do you spend each day driving around the neighborhood looking for violations?" Sandra asked. "I spend whatever time is necessary to fulfill my elected responsibilities." That wasn't really an answer. I could see Patricia's composure starting to crack slightly. "Sandra, I understand that some residents may find compliance monitoring inconvenient, but community standards exist for everyone's benefit. Property values, neighborhood aesthetics, and quality of life all depend on consistent enforcement. David's roses aren't affecting my property values," Sandra said. "And honestly, having the HOA president prowling around with measuring equipment feels a lot more problematic than a mailbox being 6 inches in the wrong direction." 34 inches, I corrected. "The roses are 4 inches too tall." Sandra stared at me. 4 inches. 4 inches. "Patricia, you're citing people for 4-inch violations." "Standards exist for a reason," Patricia replied stiffly. "Small violations lead to larger ones if left unchecked." "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard," Sandra said. Patricia's phone buzzed and she glanced at it quickly. "I need to continue my morning inspections. David, you have 12 days remaining to address the rosebush violation. Sandra, have a pleasant day." She walked away with quick, precise steps, and Sandra turned to me with an expression of complete bewilderment. 12 days to cut down roses that are 4 inches too tall. Apparently. This is insane, you know that, right? I'm starting to get that impression. Sandra was quiet for a moment, watching Patricia disappear around the corner. "David, I've been living here for 5 years, and I've never seen anything like this. She's completely out of control. Jake thinks she's probably operating within her legal authority." "Legal and right aren't the same thing." Sandra shifted her purse strap. "Look, I need to get home and sleep before my next shift, but I think we should talk to some other neighbors about this. Maybe call a meeting or something." "You think other people are dealing with this too?" "I know they are. Mrs. Patterson was cited last week for having a garden hose visible from the street. A garden hose. It was coiled up next to her house, but apparently it violated equipment storage guidelines." After Sandra left, I spent the rest of the morning researching HOA law in Arizona. What I found was both enlightening and depressing. HOA boards did have broad authority to interpret and enforce community covenants, but they were also subject to state laws regarding harassment, trespassing, and due process. The key question was whether Patricia's surveillance activities constituted harassment or exceeded her authority as HOA president. I called Jake again during my lunch break. "So here's the thing," he said after I'd described the morning's events. HOA presidents don't automatically get the right to conduct surveillance on homeowners. They can document violations they observe during normal community activities, but systematically monitoring individual properties could cross into harassment territory. What constitutes systematic monitoring? That's where it gets tricky. If she's driving by your house multiple times a day, taking photos every time she sees a potential violation, timing your activities, that starts to look less like normal compliance monitoring and more like targeted harassment. She knew exactly how long my garbage bins were out, down to the minute. That suggests she's either watching your house specifically or driving by frequently enough to catch brief time windows. Either way, it's problematic. So what can I do? Document everything. Times photos what she says. If you can prove a pattern of excessive surveillance or harassment, you might have grounds for a complaint. Complaint to who? Depends. If she's trespassing on your property, that's a police matter. If she's exceeding her HOA authority, you can petition the board or call for her removal. If it's harassment, you might be able to get a restraining order. That afternoon, I set up a small security camera pointed at my front yard. If Patricia was going to surveil me, I was going to surveil her right back. The camera caught her first visit at 6:47 a.m. the next morning. She spent 12 minutes on my property measuring not just the roses, but also the distance between my mailbox and driveway, the height of my address numbers, and the setback distance of my front steps from the sidewalk. At 11:35 a.m., she drove by slowly and stopped to take photos of my car. At 2:15 p.m., she walked past and appeared to be counting something near my trash cans. At 4:58 p.m., she returned with a different measuring device and spent 8 minutes documenting what looked like the angle of my driveway slope. 4 visits in one day, all documented on video with timestamps. I was starting to understand how she knew my garbage bins had been out for exactly 47 minutes. That evening, I got a call from my neighbor across the street, Tom Bradley. Tom was a retired firefighter who'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else. "David, I need to ask you something. Have you been having issues with Patricia?" "You could say that." "Because I've been watching her, and she's spending a hell of a lot of time around your house." "You've been watching her." Hard not to notice when someone's in your neighborhood 4 times a day with measuring equipment. My wife Dorothy started keeping track because it was making her nervous. "How long has this been going on?" "With you about 2 weeks that we've noticed, but she's been escalating with everyone for months." Tom told me about Patricia's recent citation blitz, Mrs. Patterson's garden hose, Mrs. Chen's newspaper bag, Jake's supposed excessive number of potted plants on his front porch, Sandra's non-conforming doormat, and a family on Oak Street who'd been fined for their children's bicycles being visible in their own driveway. "The thing is," Tom said, "she's not just citing people. She's showing up at their houses multiple times, taking pictures, measuring things. Mrs. Patterson told me Patricia spent an hour in her backyard last week without permission." "An hour doing what?" "Measuring fence heights, apparently. Taking photos of her patio furniture arrangement. Mrs. Patterson didn't even know she was there until she saw her through the kitchen window." "That's trespassing." "That's what I told her. But Mrs. Patterson is 83 years old and doesn't want to cause trouble." We talked for another 20 minutes, and by the end of the conversation, I had a clearer picture of what was happening. Patricia wasn't just enforcing HOA rules, she was systematically documenting every possible violation she could find, no matter how minor, and using increasingly invasive surveillance methods to do it. The next morning, I was ready for her. She arrived at 6:52 a.m., 5 minutes later than the previous day. I watched from my kitchen window as she walked directly to my rose bushes and began measuring again. I opened my front door and stepped onto the porch. "Good morning, Patricia." She looked up without surprise. "Good morning, David. I'm re-verifying yesterday's measurements for accuracy." "I need to inform you that you're being recorded." "Excuse me. I have a security camera. Your activities on my property are being recorded and time-stamped." Patricia stood up slowly, measuring tape still in her hand. "I'm conducting official HOA business on my private property without my permission. HOA compliance verification doesn't require individual homeowner permission." "Actually, I think it does." I walked closer, stopping at the edge of my porch steps. "Patricia, I've been researching Arizona property law, and I don't think you have the right to enter my property whenever you want to measure things. The HOA covenants provide authority for compliance inspection. Do they provide authority for surveillance? I'm not conducting surveillance. You've been to my house 4 times in the past 24 hours. Patricia's expression didn't change, but I noticed she'd stopped moving. I conduct compliance monitoring as needed throughout the community. Compliance monitoring that includes timing my garbage collection, photographing my car multiple times a day, and spending over an hour total on my property without permission. I document violations when I observe them during routine community inspections. Routine inspections that bring you past my house 4 times a day. I inspect the entire community regularly. How many times did you visit Jake Martinez's house yesterday? Patricia was quiet for a moment. I don't see how that's relevant. How many times did you visit Sandra Kim's house? David, if you have concerns about HOA compliance procedures, you're welcome to address them at our next board meeting. When is the next board meeting? The 2nd Tuesday of next month. That's 3 weeks away. Correct. Patricia, I want you to stop coming onto my property without permission. I have authority to conduct compliance inspections. Not on private property without reasonable cause and proper notice. Patricia clicked her measuring tape closed with a sharp snap. You seem to be confused about HOA authority, David. As a homeowner in this community, you agreed to abide by our covenants and compliance procedures when you purchased your property. Show me the section that gives you the right to trespass. I'm not trespassing. I'm conducting legitimate HOA business. 4 times in 1 day is not legitimate business. It's harassment. That's a serious accusation. Yes, it is. We stared at each other for a long moment. Patricia's perfectly styled hair didn't move in the slight morning breeze, and her grip on the clipboard never wavered. David, I'm going to give you some advice. Residents who cooperate with HOA compliance procedures generally find the process much smoother than those who choose to be confrontational. Is that a threat? It's information. Information about what? About how compliance procedures work in this community. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Patricia, are you saying that homeowners who don't cooperate with your surveillance get treated differently than those who do? I'm saying that cooperative residents generally have fewer compliance issues because they're not being monitored as closely, because they maintain their properties to community standards, or because you don't measure their roses 4 times in 24 hours. Patricia made a note on her clipboard. I think we've covered everything for this morning. Have a pleasant day, David. She walked away with the same precise steps as always, but I noticed she turned back twice to look at my house before disappearing around the corner. That afternoon, I called a meeting. I sent emails to every neighbor whose contact information I had asking if they'd like to discuss recent HOA enforcement activities. I suggested we meet in the community park that evening at 7 p.m. away from Patricia's potential surveillance routes. 12 people showed up, which was more than I'd expected, but fewer than I'd hoped for. Jake and Sandra were there, along with Tom and Dorothy Bradley, Mrs. Patterson, who had her daughter drive her the family from Oak Street, whose kids' bicycles had been sighted, and several others I recognized but didn't know well. Okay, I said, looking around at the group of folding chairs we'd arranged in a circle under the park's ramada. I think we all know why we're here. Patricia's lost her mind, said Carol Hendricks, whose potted plants had apparently been measured and photographed the previous week. She spent 45 minutes in my front yard yesterday, without asking permission, documenting everything from my doormat to my address numbers. She was in Mrs. Chen's backyard while Mrs. Chen was in the hospital, added Tom Bradley, taking photos of her patio furniture arrangement and measuring her fence height. Wait, said Jake. She was in Mrs. Chen's backyard while Mrs. Chen wasn't even home. Dorothy saw her, called me over to witness it. Dorothy Bradley nodded emphatically. She had a ladder, a folding ladder. She was measuring the height of Mrs. Chen's back fence. Why? Asked Sandra. Apparently the fence might be 2 inches taller than community standards allow, Tom replied. 2 inches, repeated the father from Oak Street. 2 inches. Mrs. Patterson's daughter, Lisa, raised her hand tentatively. My mother is afraid to leave her house now. She's worried Patricia will be in her yard measuring things when she gets back. That's not paranoia, I said. Patricia was at my house 4 times yesterday, 4 separate times. I have it on security camera. I pulled out my phone and showed them the footage. Watching it as a group somehow made it seem even more invasive than it had when I'd reviewed it alone. "This is stalking," said Carol. "This is harassment," said Sandra. "This is completely insane," said Jake. "The question is," said Tom Bradley, "what can we do about it?" I'd been researching that question for 3 days. Legally, we have a few options. If she's trespassing on private property without permission, that's a police matter. If she's exceeding her authority as HOA president, we can petition for her removal or call a special meeting to vote her out. If it constitutes harassment, we might be able to get restraining orders. "What constitutes harassment in HOA situations?" asked Lisa. "Systematic surveillance, repeated unwanted contact, intimidation tactics, and exceeding reasonable enforcement standards," Jake replied. "The key word is systematic. If we can prove she's targeting specific residents with excessive monitoring, that's harassment." "How do we prove that?" asked Carol. "Documentation. Photos, videos, time logs, witness statements. We need to show a pattern of behavior that goes beyond normal HOA compliance activities." Sandra leaned forward. "I keep a work journal for my nursing shifts. I've been noting every time I see Patricia in the neighborhood when I leave for work or come home. In the past 2 weeks, I've seen her 23 times. That's more than once a day." "What times?" asked Dorothy. "All different. Early morning, mid-afternoon, evening. Sometimes twice in the same day." "That's not normal compliance monitoring," said Tom. "That's patrol activity." Mrs. Patterson spoke up for the first time, her voice quiet but clear. "She told me I needed to remove my bird feeder because it might attract rodents. I've had that feeder for 15 years. Never had a rodent problem." "Did she cite you for it?" I asked. "She said she would if I didn't remove it voluntarily." Mrs. Patterson's hands shook slightly as she adjusted her purse. "I took it down." The group was quiet for a moment. "How many of you have received citations in the past month?" I asked. 10 hands went up. "How many received citations in the 6 months before Patricia became president?" 3 hands stayed up. Jake whistled softly. "That's a pretty clear pattern of escalation." "The question is what we do with this information," said Tom. "I think we start by formally requesting a special HOA meeting," I said. "We present our concerns about excessive enforcement and request policy changes to limit surveillance activities." "And if that doesn't work?" asked Carol. "Then we document everything and pursue legal remedies. Harassment complaints, trespassing charges, whatever applies." "What about just talking to her?" asked Lisa. "Maybe she doesn't realize how invasive this has become." Several people laughed, but not in a mean way. "I tried talking to her," said Sandra. "She told me that community standards require systematic compliance monitoring." "I asked her to stop measuring my plants," said Carol. "She told me that homeowner preferences don't override HOA authority." "She measured my mailbox 4 times in 3 days," I added. When I asked her why, she said she needed to verify her measurements for accuracy. "That's not normal behavior," said Dorothy Bradley. "No," agreed her husband, "it's not." We spent another hour planning our approach. By the end of the meeting, we'd decided to request a special HOA board meeting for the following week, prepare written statements documenting each of our experiences, and begin keeping detailed logs of Patricia's surveillance activities. I volunteered to draft the meeting request and coordinate our documentation efforts. As people were packing up their chairs and heading home, Sandra pulled me aside. "David, I need to tell you something. Patricia's not just surveilling homeowners." "What do you mean?" "I mean she's been asking other residents questions about you specifically. Questions like what? When you leave for work, when you come home, whether you have overnight guests, how often you work in your yard. She told Mrs. Morrison she was conducting a compliance assessment and needed to understand your activity patterns." I felt the same cold feeling I'd had that morning when Patricia had made her threat about cooperative residents having fewer compliance issues. "When did this happen?" 3 days ago. Mrs. Morrison thought it was weird enough to mention it to me when I was walking my dog." "Did Patricia ask about anyone else?" "Not that Mrs. Morrison mentioned, just you." I drove home that night feeling like I'd stepped into some kind of alternate reality where HOA presidents conducted surveillance operations on individual homeowners and called it community service. But I also felt something else: determination. Patricia might have the authority to enforce HOA rules, but she didn't have the right to turn our neighborhood into her personal surveillance state. The next morning I was ready when she arrived at 6:48 a.m. This time, instead of watching from my kitchen window, I met her at my front gate. "Good morning, Patricia." "Good morning, David. I need to inform you that I'm requesting you not enter my property without written notice and a specific compliance issue to investigate." "I'm conducting routine compliance verification. Based on what specific violation?" "Your rose bushes remain out of compliance." "Have they grown in the past 24 hours? Patricia paused. "I'm verifying that no corrective action has been taken." "You verified that yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that." "Compliance verification may require multiple inspections." "Patricia, I'm formally requesting that you provide 24 hours written notice before entering my property for any reason." HOA compliance procedures don't require advance notice for routine inspections. "Show me that policy." "It's covered under General Compliance Authority in the Community Covenants." "Which section?" "I don't have the document with me." "Patricia, I've read the Community Covenants. There's nothing that gives you the right to enter private property daily without specific cause or notice." "Your rose bushes are specific cause. For daily inspections, for compliance verification is needed." I pulled out my phone and opened the recording app. "Patricia, I'm recording this conversation. For the record, are you saying that a 4-inch height violation on rose bushes justifies daily entry onto private property?" Patricia looked at my phone, then back at my face. "I don't consent to being recorded. This is my property. I have the right to record interactions that take place here. I'm conducting official HOA business on my private property, which gives me the right to document the interaction." Patricia stood very still for a moment, and I could see her calculating something behind her eyes. "David, I think you're misunderstanding the nature of HOA authority. As a board member elected by this community, I have both the right and the responsibility to ensure compliance with our established standards." "I understand that. What I don't understand is why compliance with rosebush height requires daily surveillance of my property." "I'm not conducting surveillance. What would you call 4 visits in 24 hours? Thorough compliance verification." "Patricia, I've spoken with other neighbors. You're not conducting this level of thorough verification at every property in the community. Different properties have different compliance needs. Based on what criteria? Based on the nature and severity of violations. 4-inch roses are severe violations. All violations are taken seriously in this community." I looked at her standing there in my front yard, clipboard in hand, and realized that this conversation was going to continue in circles until one of us walked away. "Patricia, I'm formally requesting that you leave my property and not return without written notice and a specific violation to investigate." "I have a specific violation to investigate, which you've already investigated multiple times, which remains unresolved." "Patricia, leave my property." "I haven't completed my inspection." "You've completed it 4 times in the past week. Leave my property." Patricia made a note on her clipboard. "I'll note your refusal to cooperate with HOA compliance procedures." "Note whatever you want. Leave my property." "David, I strongly advise you to reconsider your approach to this situation." "Is that a threat?" "It's advice." "Patricia, for the 4th time, leave my property." She looked at me for a long moment, then at my phone, then back at me. "Have a pleasant day, David." She walked away, but instead of leaving the neighborhood, she stopped at my mailbox and began measuring the distance between the post and the street. I walked down my driveway. "Patricia, what are you doing?" "The mailbox is on the public right-of-way. I have every right to take measurements here." "For what purpose?" "Compliance verification." "Of what violation?" "Potential setback violations." "Based on what complaint?" "Based on routine compliance monitoring." I stood there watching her measure the distance from my mailbox to the street from 3 different angles and realized that this was Patricia's new strategy. If I wouldn't let her on my property, she'd find reasons to spend time as close to my property as possible. Over the next 3 days, Patricia found reasons to inspect my mailbox area 6 times, measure the distance between my driveway and the sidewalk twice, and document the positioning of my garbage cans every morning and evening. She was careful to stay on public property, but her message was clear: if I wanted to play hardball, she was prepared to escalate. On Friday morning, I got a certified letter from the HOA. It was a formal violation notice for obstruction of compliance procedures and refusal to cooperate with authorized inspections. The fine was $500 with an additional $250 per day until the obstruction was resolved. According to the letter, my refusal to allow daily property inspections constituted a violation of community cooperation standards and undermined the HOA's ability to maintain neighborhood quality. I called Jake immediately. "They can't fine you for refusing unlimited property access," he said after I'd read him the entire letter. "That's not how HOA authority works. But they did fine me. They can issue the fine, but it won't hold up if you challenge it. No HOA has unlimited inspection rights on private property. So what do? Document everything, file a formal challenge to the fine, and request an emergency board meeting. This is exactly the kind of overreach that can get an HOA president removed." That afternoon, I drafted a detailed letter challenging the fine and requesting an emergency board meeting. I included photos of Patricia's measuring activities, timestamps from my security footage, and witness statements from 5 neighbors. I also did something else I called the Phoenix Police Department's non-emergency line and asked about filing a harassment complaint. The officer who took my call was professional but skeptical. "What kind of harassment are we talking about?" "Repeated unwanted entry onto private property, systematic surveillance, and intimidation tactics." "By who?" "My HOA president." There was a pause. "Sir, HOA disputes are generally civil matters unless there's evidence of criminal activity." "What constitutes criminal activity in this context?" "Actual trespassing after being formally warned, stalking, harassment that creates reasonable fear, destruction of property, that kind of thing." "What about entering private property daily without permission?" "Depends on whether they have legitimate authority to be there. You'd need to demonstrate that their access exceeds their legal HOA authority." "How do I do that?" "Documentation, photos, videos, witness statements, and probably a lawyer familiar with HOA law." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and thought about how this situation had escalated from 4-inch roses to police complaints in less than 2 weeks. That evening, Sandra called me. "David, I need to tell you something. Patricia came to my house today." "For compliance verification?" "No. She said she wanted to discuss my concerns about HOA procedures that I'd expressed during our conversation about your mailbox." She brought up our conversation. She said that residents who spread misinformation about HOA authority could face consequences for undermining community cooperation. "She threatened you." "She said that homeowners who encourage non-compliance in others might find themselves subject to increased compliance scrutiny." "Sandra, she's retaliating against you for defending me." "That's what I thought too." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that I had every right to express my opinions about HOA policies, and if she had a problem with that, she could address it at a board meeting." "How did she respond?" "She said board meetings were for policy discussions, not for questioning the authority of elected officials." "That's not how board meetings work." "I know. But David, I'm starting to think she believes her own rhetoric about HOA authority. Like she really thinks being elected HOA president gives her some kind of special legal status." "What do you mean?" "I mean, she talks about authorized inspections and compliance procedures and official HOA business, like she's a government official instead of a neighbor elected to manage community maintenance." "That's a good point." "She also asked me about your work schedule." "My work schedule?" "When you leave, when you come home, whether you work from home some days." She said she needed to understand property usage patterns for compliance assessment. "Sandra, that's not normal HOA activity, that's surveillance." "I know, that's why I'm calling you." On Monday morning, Patricia was back. She arrived at 6:30 a.m. earlier than usual and went directly to her measuring activities. But this time, she wasn't alone. She had brought someone with her, a man in his 50s wearing a polo shirt and carrying what looked like professional surveying equipment. I watched from my kitchen window as they spent 20 minutes measuring and documenting everything from my roses to my mailbox to the slope of my driveway. When I went outside to investigate, Patricia introduced her companion as Robert Chen, certified property assessor. "Good morning, David," Patricia said with her usual smile. We're conducting a comprehensive compliance assessment of your property. Based on what authority? Based on your refusal to cooperate with standard compliance procedures, Robert replied. The HOA has the right to hire professional assessment services when homeowner cooperation is insufficient. I never refused to cooperate. I refused to allow daily entry onto my property without specific cause. Refusal to allow compliance inspections constitutes non-cooperation under community standards, Patricia said. And non-cooperation triggers enhanced assessment procedures, Robert added. I looked at the two of them standing in my front yard with their clipboards and measuring equipment and realized that Patricia had found a way to escalate the situation beyond anything I'd imagined. How much is this enhanced assessment costing the HOA? I asked. Professional compliance services are a necessary community expense, Patricia replied. That's not what I asked. The cost of professional assessment services is allocated to the homeowner requesting enhanced procedures, Robert said. I didn't request any enhanced procedures. Your non-cooperation with standard procedures triggered the need for enhanced assessment, Patricia explained. So I'm being charged for a professional assessment that I didn't request conducted because I refused to allow daily inspection of my property. Enhanced compliance procedures include cost allocation to the responsible homeowner. Robert confirmed. I felt something snap in my chest. Get off my property. We're conducting authorized compliance assessment, Patricia said. I don't care what you call it. Get off my property right now. David, I strongly advise against obstructing professional compliance procedures, Robert said. I'm not obstructing anything. I'm exercising my rights as a property owner. Get off my property. Patricia made a note on her clipboard. Robert, please document the homeowner's refusal to cooperate with professional assessment procedures. Already noted, Robert replied. This is trespassing, I said. I'm ordering you to leave my property immediately. This is authorized HOA compliance activity, Patricia said. I don't care what you call it. Leave my property or I'm calling the police. Patricia and Robert exchanged glances. We've completed sufficient measurements for the initial assessment, Robert said. We can finalize the report based on current documentation. They packed up their equipment and walked away, but not before Patricia handed me another certified letter. Enhanced compliance assessment procedures and associated costs, she said. You have 10 days to remit payment. I looked at the envelope in my hands and felt like I was holding a declaration of war. The letter contained a bill for $1,800 for professional property compliance assessment services and an additional $250 fine for obstruction of enhanced compliance procedures. I called Jake immediately. They can't bill you for assessment services you didn't request, he said after I'd read him the letter. And they definitely can't fine you for refusing to cooperate with unauthorized inspections. But they did. David, I think it's time to lawyer up. This has gone way beyond normal HOA enforcement. You think a lawyer will take a case about 4-inch roses? I think a lawyer will take a case about harassment, unauthorized surveillance, excessive fines, and improper billing practices. The roses are just the excuse. That afternoon, I made 2 phone calls, one to a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes and one to the Phoenix Police Department to file a formal trespassing complaint. The lawyer, Margaret Torres, agreed to meet with me the next day. The police officer said they'd send someone out to take a report. Officer Rodriguez arrived at 4 p.m. and listened carefully as I explained the situation and showed him the security footage of Patricia's repeated visits to my property. So this woman is your HOA president? He asked. Yes. And she's been on your property without permission multiple times every day for 2 weeks. Even after you've asked her to stop? Even after I've explicitly told her to leave. Officer Rodriguez made notes in his report. The problem is that HOA authority can be complicated. If she has legitimate grounds for inspection under your community covenants, it might not be criminal trespassing. What if she doesn't have legitimate grounds? Then it could be trespassing, but you'd need to prove that her inspections exceed her legal authority. How do I prove that? Usually with legal representation and documentation that shows the HOA is exceeding its authority under state law and community covenants. I'm meeting with a lawyer tomorrow. Good. In the meantime, I'll file this report and document your complaint. If she continues entering your property after being formally warned, call us immediately." Officer Rodriguez left a copy of the trespassing complaint with me and advised Patricia's house that a formal complaint had been filed. 20 minutes after he left, my phone rang. "David, this is Patricia Whitman. I understand you filed a police complaint regarding legitimate HOA compliance activities." "Patricia, I filed a complaint about repeated trespassing on my property. I want to clarify that all HOA compliance procedures are conducted within established legal authority. That's for the police and lawyers to determine. David, I think there's been a misunderstanding about HOA authority that we should resolve before this situation escalates further." "I think the misunderstanding is yours, Patricia, about the extent of your authority and the rights of homeowners. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss your concerns about compliance procedures. I'd like you to stop entering my property without permission. Compliance verification requires periodic property assessment. Compliance verification doesn't require daily surveillance and harassment. No one is conducting surveillance or harassment. Patricia, you've been to my property 17 times in 2 weeks. You've hired a professional assessor to measure my roses. You've questioned my neighbors about my work schedule. That's harassment. That's compliance monitoring. Patricia, don't come to my property again without a court order. David, I strongly advise you to reconsider your approach to this situation." Is that another threat? It's advice about the consequences of obstructing HOA authority. "Patricia, I'm recording this conversation. Do you want to repeat that threat for the record?" The line went quiet for a moment. "Have a pleasant evening, David." She hung up. The next morning I met with Margaret Torres at her law office in downtown Phoenix. Margaret was a sharp woman in her 50s who'd been handling HOA disputes for 15 years. "I've reviewed the documents you sent me," she said, spreading files across her conference table. "And I have to say this is one of the more egregious cases of HOA overreach I've seen. So I'm not crazy. You're definitely not crazy. No HOA has the authority to conduct daily surveillance of individual properties, hire professional assessors without cause, or retaliate against homeowners who exercise their rights. What can we do about it? Several things. First, we file a formal complaint with the HOA board challenging all fines and assessment charges. Second, we petition for Patricia's removal as president based on exceeding her authority. Third, if necessary, we file a harassment lawsuit in Superior Court. What are the chances of success? Very good based on what you've documented. The key is that Patricia has clearly exceeded any reasonable interpretation of HOA authority. Daily property inspections, professional assessments for minor violations, retaliation against neighbors who support you, none of that is legally defensible. How long will this take? Depends on how cooperative the rest of the HOA board is. If they're reasonable people who recognize that Patricia has gone too far, we might resolve this quickly. If they support her approach, it could take several months. What happens in the meantime? We get an immediate injunction preventing further harassment while the case is pending. Margaret agreed to take my case and immediately began drafting documents for an emergency hearing to stop Patricia's surveillance activities. But Patricia wasn't done escalating. That evening, I got calls from 3 neighbors telling me that Patricia had visited them to discuss my disruptive behavior and its impact on community harmony. According to Sandra, Patricia had told her that homeowners who encourage legal action against the HOA were undermining community cooperation and might find themselves subject to enhanced compliance monitoring. According to Jake, Patricia had asked him whether he thought I had anger management issues and whether my confrontational behavior made him concerned for neighborhood safety. According to Tom Bradley, Patricia had suggested that my refusal to follow community standards was setting a bad example and asked if he'd noticed any other concerning behavior patterns. Patricia was conducting a campaign to isolate me and paint me as a troublemaker who threatened community harmony. The next morning, I wasn't surprised when she arrived at 6:15 a.m. with additional equipment. This time, she had brought a professional camera with a telephoto lens and was taking detailed photos of my house from the street. I went outside to confront her. "Patricia, what are you doing?" "Documenting current property conditions for legal purposes." "Legal purposes? Given your decision to pursue legal action against the HOA, we need comprehensive documentation of all compliance issues. From the public street, I have every right to photograph property exteriors from public areas. She wasn't wrong about that, but the implications were clear. If I wanted to involve lawyers, she was prepared to document every possible violation she could find. I watched her spend 45 minutes photographing my house from every possible angle, zooming in on details like my address numbers, my doormat, my mailbox, and yes, my roses. When she was finished, she walked over to where I was standing on my porch. David, I want you to understand something. The HOA exists to protect property values and community standards for everyone. When individual homeowners decide that rules don't apply to them, it affects the entire neighborhood. Patricia, the rules applied to me just fine, until you decided that 4-inch roses required daily surveillance. The rules applied to you until you decided to obstruct compliance procedures. I didn't obstruct compliance procedures. I refused to allow unlimited access to my property. Same thing. No, it's not. Patricia consulted her clipboard. David, I'm prepared to offer you a compromise. I'm listening. Resolve all current violations, pay the associated fines and assessment costs, and agree to cooperate with future compliance procedures, and we can consider this matter closed. How much are we talking about? $2,400 in fines and assessment costs, plus compliance with rosebush height requirements. You want me to pay $2,400 and destroy my roses? I want you to comply with community standards and resolve this situation before it escalates further. Patricia, the only escalation here is coming from you. David, you have until Friday to consider my offer. After that, the HOA will pursue all available remedies to ensure compliance. What remedies? Legal action to enforce community covenants, including property liens if necessary. Property lines. The HOA has the authority to place liens on properties with outstanding compliance violations. I stared at her. You're threatening to put a lien on my house over 4-inch roses. I'm informing you of the potential consequences of continued non-compliance. Patricia, you need to leave my property right now. I'm on the public sidewalk. Then you need to stop harassing me and my neighbors. I'm conducting legitimate HOA business. No, you're conducting a personal vendetta. Patricia smiled her thin smile. Have a pleasant day, David. That afternoon, Margaret Torres filed for an emergency restraining order to stop Patricia's harassment activities. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. But Patricia had one more escalation planned. On Friday morning, I woke up to find a certified letter from the HOA's attorney threatening immediate legal action if I didn't comply with all outstanding violations and associated penalties within 72 hours. The letter also informed me that the HOA would be seeking to recover all legal costs associated with enforcement actions from me personally. I called Margaret immediately. They're bluffing, she said after I'd read her the letter. No court is going to award legal fees for HOA enforcement of 4-inch rose violations. But they can try anything. The question is whether they want to spend thousands of dollars in legal fees to pursue a case they can't win. Maybe they think I'll cave rather than fight it. Maybe. But David, I need to ask you something. Are you prepared to see this through because Patricia seems determined to make this as expensive and difficult as possible? I thought about my roses planted by my ex-wife 6 years ago. I thought about Mrs. Patterson taking down her bird feeder after 15 years because she was afraid of Patricia's threats. I thought about Mrs. Chen recovering from hip surgery while Patricia measured her fence in her backyard. Yes, I said, I'm prepared to see this through. Good, because I think we're going to win, and when we do, it'll set a precedent that protects every homeowner in your community from this kind of harassment. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. on Tuesday morning. Margaret had prepared a comprehensive filing documenting Patricia's escalating harassment, including security footage, witness statements, and evidence of retaliation against neighbors who supported me. Monday evening, I got a call from Tom Bradley. David, you need to know something. Patricia's called a special HOA board meeting for tomorrow night. What's the agenda? Emergency action regarding disruptive homeowner behavior and legal threats against the association. Legal threats. She's telling the other board members that you're suing the HOA and that they need to take immediate action to protect the community. I'm not suing the HOA. I'm seeking a restraining order against her personally for harassment. I don't think she's making that distinction. Who else is on the board? Patricia, obviously. Then there's Jim Morrison, Carol Hendricks, and Susan Martinez. Carol Hendricks. She was at our meeting in the park. She knows what Patricia's been doing. She's also been cited by Patricia 3 times in the past month. She might be afraid to oppose her. What about the others? Jim's pretty much stayed out of HOA politics. Susan's new, just elected 6 months ago. I don't think either of them really understands what's been going on. Can you attend the meeting? Board meetings are technically closed to homeowners unless they're specifically invited to address the board. So Patricia controls who gets to speak. As president, yes. I hung up feeling like Patricia had been planning this confrontation for weeks, positioning herself as the defender of community standards against a disruptive homeowner who threatened the HOA with legal action. Tuesday morning, Margaret and I arrived at the courthouse at 9:30 a.m. The hearing was scheduled for 10, but Judge Harrison's calendar was running late. We finally got called at 11:15. Judge Harrison was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd clearly seen her share of neighbor disputes. She listened carefully as Margaret presented our case, referring frequently to the security footage and witness statements. Patricia's attorney, Richard Paulson, argued that Patricia was acting within her authority as HOA president and that my complaint was an attempt to avoid legitimate compliance requirements. Your Honor, Margaret said during her rebuttal, this case isn't about HOA authority or compliance requirements. It's about harassment. No HOA has the right to conduct daily surveillance of individual homeowners or retaliate against residents who question their methods. Mr. Paulson. Judge Harrison said, "Can you explain why daily property inspections are necessary for rosebush height violations? Your Honor, the respondent's refusal to cooperate with standard compliance procedures necessitated enhanced monitoring to ensure community standards are maintained. Enhanced monitoring that includes hiring professional assessors for 4-inch violations. The HOA has broad discretion in determining appropriate enforcement measures. Broad discretion, yes. Unlimited discretion, no." Judge Harrison reviewed the documents in front of her. "I'm granting a temporary restraining order prohibiting the respondent from entering the petitioner's property without written notice and specific cause. The respondent is also prohibited from photographing or surveilling the petitioner's property from public areas more than once per week. Your Honor." Paulson objected, "This severely limits the HOA's ability to conduct legitimate compliance monitoring." Mr. Paulson, legitimate compliance monitoring doesn't require daily surveillance. The HOA can verify compliance through reasonable periodic inspections with proper notice. Margaret squeezed my arm as Judge Harrison signed the order. "The full hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks from today," the judge continued. "Mr. Paulson, I strongly encourage your client to consider whether pursuing enforcement of 4-inch violations is worth the legal costs and community disruption this case is generating." As we left the courthouse, Margaret was smiling. "That went better than I expected," she said. "Judge Harrison clearly thinks Patricia's behavior is excessive. What happens now? Now we serve Patricia with a restraining order, and she has to stop her surveillance activities while we prepare for the full hearing. And the HOA board meeting tonight? Hopefully the other board members will see this restraining order as a wake-up call and rein Patricia in before this gets any worse." That evening I waited for news from the HOA board meeting. I didn't have to wait long. Jake called me at 9:15 p.m. "David, you're not going to believe what happened." "I'm listening." "Patricia convinced the board to approve legal action against you for frivolous litigation and harassment of HOA officials." "What?" "She told them you were trying to destroy the HOA's ability to maintain community standards and that they needed to take a strong stand against homeowners who think rules don't apply to them." "What did the other board members say?" Carol tried to explain that Patricia's enforcement methods were excessive, but Patricia cut her off and said that board members who don't support community standards should consider whether they're fit to serve. She threatened Carol. Pretty much. Susan Martinez asked some questions about the costs of legal action, but Patricia said that setting a precedent was worth the expense. "What about Jim Morrison?" "He didn't say much. I think he was overwhelmed by Patricia's presentation and just went along with whatever she recommended. So they're going to sue me. They authorized Patricia to pursue legal action to protect HOA authority and recover costs associated with frivolous complaints. I sat in my kitchen staring out at my roses in the fading light and marveled at how completely Patricia had managed to reframe the situation. In her version, I was the aggressor who was threatening community harmony and forcing the HOA to spend money on legal defense. The next morning, I got a call from Margaret. "David, we have a problem. Patricia's attorney has filed a countersuit claiming that your harassment complaint is frivolous and requesting legal fees." "Can they do that?" "They can file it. Whether they can win it is another question. But it means this case is going to be more complicated and expensive than I originally anticipated." "How expensive?" "Hard to say. Could be anywhere from $5,000 to $20,000 depending on how far they push it." $20,000 over 4-inch roses. Over the principle of the thing, apparently. Patricia seems determined to establish that HOA presidents have unlimited authority to enforce community standards however they see fit. And if she wins, it sets a precedent that could affect HOA authority statewide. Other HOA presidents would have legal backing to conduct similar surveillance and harassment activities. So this isn't just about my roses anymore. No, it's not. This is about the limits of HOA power and the rights of homeowners to be free from harassment in their own homes. That afternoon, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called a press conference. Margaret thought I was crazy, but agreed to help me contact local media outlets. By Thursday morning, I had commitments from 2 television stations, a newspaper reporter, and a blogger who covered HOA issues for a regional website. We set up in the community park at 2 p.m. with my house and the disputed roses visible in the background. The story was too good for media to resist. HOA president conducts surveillance operation over 4-inch roses. Homeowner fights back with restraining order. Association sues for $20,000. Channel 12's report led with footage of my roses and the headline, "HOA Wars Association Sues Homeowner Over Rose Bush Height." The reporter Jessica Martinez interviewed me about Patricia's surveillance activities and spoke with several neighbors about the escalating enforcement actions throughout the community. "In your opinion," Jessica asked me on camera, "is this really about rosebush height?" "No," I said. "This is about whether HOA presidents can turn neighborhoods into surveillance states and call it community service." Jessica also tried to interview Patricia, but Patricia declined to appear on camera. Her statement, read by the reporter, claimed that the HOA was committed to maintaining community standards and protecting the authority of elected officials to serve the community. The story aired on the 6 o'clock news and was picked up by the newspaper's website that evening. By Friday morning, I had received over 200 emails and phone calls from homeowners throughout Arizona sharing their own HOA horror stories. But I also received something else, a call from Carol Hendricks. "David, I need to talk to you. Can we meet somewhere private?" We met at a coffee shop 20 minutes away from the neighborhood. "I'm resigning from the HOA board," Carol said without preamble. "Because of this situation, because I can't continue to serve with Patricia. She's completely out of control, and the other board members are either afraid of her or don't understand what she's doing." What happened after the news story aired? Patricia called an emergency board meeting. She said the media coverage was damaging the community's reputation and that we needed to take immediate action to control the narrative. What kind of action? She wants to hire a public relations firm to counter your false claims about HOA enforcement. She also wants to pursue legal action against you for defamation. Defamation for what? For calling her activities surveillance and harassment. But that's what they are. I know that. You know that. But Patricia has convinced herself that she's the victim here. Carol told me that Patricia had spent 45 minutes at the emergency meeting describing me as a disruptive homeowner who was trying to destroy the HOA system and encourage lawlessness throughout the community. She actually used the word lawlessness, Carol said, like 4-inch roses were going to lead to neighborhood anarchy. What did the other board members say? Susan asked some good questions about proportionality and legal costs, but Patricia shut her down by suggesting that board members who don't support enforcement are part of the problem. And Jim seems to think that standing behind Patricia is the same as standing behind the HOA. He doesn't understand that Patricia is the problem, not the solution. So what happens now? Now Patricia has board support to pursue legal action against you for defamation in addition to the existing cases. And she wants to hire a PR firm at community expense to fight your media campaign. Carol, this is insane. I know. That's why I'm resigning. I can't be part of an organization that's spending thousands of dollars to harass a homeowner over rosebush height. After Carol left, I sat in the coffee shop for a long time thinking about how this situation had spun completely out of control. What had started as a 4-inch violation had become a legal battle involving restraining orders, countersuits, defamation claims, and public relations firms. Patricia had managed to escalate a minor landscaping issue into a community crisis that was costing thousands of dollars and destroying neighborhood relationships. But I also realized something else: the media attention was working. That evening I got a call from Susan Martinez, the newest HOA board member. Mr. Davidson, I hope you don't mind me calling you directly. Not at all. I wanted you to know that I'll be requesting a special meeting to reconsider the board's position on this situation. What changed your mind? Several things. The restraining order, the media coverage, and frankly, Patricia's reaction to both. I've been doing some research on HOA law, and I don't think we have the legal standing she claims we do. What kind of research? I contacted an attorney who specializes in HOA governance. He told me that boards can face personal liability if they pursue legal action that exceeds their authority or constitutes harassment. Personal liability. If a court finds that board members knowingly supported harassment or frivolous litigation, we could be personally responsible for legal costs. That's a powerful incentive to be reasonable. Exactly. I'm not willing to risk my personal assets to support Patricia's vendetta against you. Susan told me she'd been talking to other homeowners in the community and was hearing similar stories about Patricia's excessive enforcement activities. The more people I talked to, the more I realized this isn't about maintaining community standards. It's about Patricia exercising power for its own sake. Are you going to have enough support to overrule her? I think so. Carol's resignation letter was pretty damning, and Jim's starting to ask questions about legal costs and liability. What about Patricia? Patricia's going to fight this every step of the way, but she's only one vote on a 4-member board, and if the other 3 of us agree to change course, she'll be outvoted. The special board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. This time it would be open to community members, and I was specifically invited to address the board about my concerns. Over the weekend, I prepared my presentation carefully. Margaret helped me organize the documentation of Patricia's activities and their escalating costs to the community. By the time the meeting started, the community center was packed. Word had spread throughout the neighborhood about the legal battle, and homeowners wanted to hear both sides of the story. Patricia opened the meeting by reading a prepared statement about the importance of community standards and the dangers of allowing individual homeowners to undermine HOA authority. The issue before us tonight, she said, is whether this community will maintain the standards that protect our property values and quality of life, or whether we'll allow disruptive residents to ignore rules that apply to everyone else. She spoke for 15 minutes about the importance of consistent enforcement and the precedent that would be set if homeowners could refuse compliance inspections. Mr. Davidson's actions threaten the very foundation of community governance, she concluded. If we allow residents to pick and choose which rules they'll follow, we no longer have a community, we have chaos. When it was my turn to speak, I focused on the specific actions Patricia had taken and their impact on the community. Over the past month, I said, Patricia has visited my property 37 times. She's hired professional assessors to measure 4-inch roses at community expense. She's questioned neighbors about my personal schedule and threatened residents who supported my position. I showed the board security footage of Patricia's daily surveillance activities and read excerpts from the restraining order that documented her harassment. This isn't about community standards, I said. This is about one person's interpretation of her authority and her willingness to escalate minor violations into community-wide conflicts. I also presented information about the legal costs the community was facing. The HOA has spent over $12,000 in legal fees pursuing this case. The PR firm Patricia wants to hire would cost another $8,000. We're talking about $20,000 in community money to fight over 4-inch roses. Finally, I addressed the broader implications of Patricia's approach. If this board supports Patricia's surveillance and harassment activities, you're establishing a precedent that HOA presidents can monitor homeowners daily enter private property without reasonable cause and retaliate against residents who question their methods. That's not a community I want to live in, and I don't think it's a community any of you want to live in either. After I finished speaking, Susan Martinez asked Patricia to respond to specific allegations about the frequency of property visits and the hiring of professional assessors. Patricia's response was revealing. Compliance monitoring requires systematic documentation of violations and verification of corrective actions. Mr. Davidson's refusal to cooperate with standard procedures necessitated enhanced monitoring protocols. But 37 visits, Susan asked, for Rosebush Height? The number of visits required depends on the homeowner's willingness to address violations promptly. Patricia said, Jim Morrison speaking up for the first time. Don't you think 37 visits is excessive for any violation? I think consistent enforcement is essential for community standards. But 37 visits, Jim repeated. As many visits as necessary. Susan leaned forward. Patricia, at what point would you consider the monitoring excessive? When violations are resolved and compliance is achieved. So, if a homeowner refuses to trim 4-inch roses, you would continue daily visits indefinitely. I would continue compliance monitoring as long as violations persist. Jim Morrison looked stunned. Patricia, that sounds like harassment. That sounds like leadership. The room was quiet for a moment as the implications of Patricia's position sank in. Susan Martinez was the first to speak. I move that the board immediately cease all legal action against Mr. Davidson and rescind all fines and assessment charges related to this matter. I second the motion, said Jim Morrison. Patricia's face went pale. This board has a responsibility to maintain community standards and support elected officials in their duties. This board has a responsibility to act reasonably and within our legal authority, Susan replied. Patricia, your enforcement activities have clearly exceeded any reasonable interpretation of HOA authority. I've acted within established guidelines throughout this situation. Which guidelines authorize daily surveillance of homeowners? Jim asked. Compliance monitoring guidelines. Show me the specific language that authorizes 37 property visits for Rosebush Height. Patricia consulted her clipboard, but for the first time in our interactions, she seemed uncertain. The Compliance Monitoring Authority is established in the general enforcement provisions of the community covenants. The general provisions don't specify surveillance frequency, Susan said, and they certainly don't authorize harassment of residents who question enforcement methods. The motion to cease legal action and rescind fines passed by a vote of 2-1, with Patricia casting the only opposing vote. But Patricia wasn't finished. I wanted on the record that this board is abandoning its responsibility to maintain community standards and establishing a precedent that will undermine HOA authority throughout this community. Patricia. Susan said gently, we're establishing a precedent that HOA boards will act reasonably and proportionally when enforcing community standards. Mr. Davidson's roses remain in violation of community height requirements. Then we'll send him a polite letter asking him to trim them like normal people would do. A polite letter that he'll ignore just like he's ignored previous violations notices. Then we'll send another polite letter. But we won't conduct daily surveillance, hire professional assessors, or threaten legal action over 4 inches. Patricia gathered her papers with sharp, angry movements. This board has made a serious mistake tonight. Community standards exist for a reason, and consistent enforcement is essential for maintaining property values and neighborhood quality. Patricia. Jim said, I think we all support community standards, we just don't support harassment. There's no difference between effective enforcement and what you call harassment. Yes, there is, Susan replied, "and tonight's vote establishes that this board understands the difference." After the meeting ended, dozens of neighbors approached me to share their own experiences with Patricia's enforcement activities and express relief that the situation was finally being resolved. Mrs. Patterson, who had been too afraid to attend the meeting, called me the next morning. "David, my neighbor, told me what happened last night. Does this mean I can put my bird feeder back up?" "Mrs. Patterson, I think you can put your bird feeder wherever you want. And Patricia won't cite me for attracting rodents. The board voted to end excessive enforcement. I think your bird feeder is safe." Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment. "You know, I've lived in this neighborhood for 22 years, and I've never been afraid of an HOA president before." "You shouldn't have to be afraid of your neighbors, Mrs. Patterson. That's not what community associations are supposed to be about." Margaret called me that afternoon with an update on the legal situation. Patricia's attorney has withdrawn the defamation claim and is requesting dismissal of the countersuit. It looks like the HOA board's vote convinced them they don't have support for continued litigation. "What about the restraining order?" "We'll probably make it permanent at the hearing next week just to establish clear boundaries going forward." "And the costs?" "The HOA will be responsible for their own legal fees, but you won't have to pay anything beyond our agreed fee structure." "So it's over. The legal part is over. The community part might take longer to heal." Margaret was right about the healing process. Over the following weeks, the neighborhood gradually returned to something resembling normal, but Patricia's surveillance campaign had damaged relationships and created lasting suspicion. Some residents continued to support Patricia's strict enforcement approach, arguing that community standards required consistent monitoring and that my resistance had undermined HOA authority. Others felt that Patricia had crossed the line into harassment and were relieved that the board had voted to change course. Patricia herself seemed to oscillate between defiant defense of her actions and grudging acceptance of the board's decision. She continued to serve as HOA president, but her enforcement activities became noticeably less aggressive. The roses, for what it's worth, remained at their original height. The board sent me a polite letter requesting that I consider trimming them to compliance height, and I politely declined. No further action was taken. 3 months later, Patricia announced that she would not seek re-election as HOA president. Her resignation letter, read at the September board meeting, claimed that she was stepping down due to insufficient community support for maintaining established standards and board interference with necessary enforcement activities. Susan Martinez was elected as the new HOA president on a platform of reasonable enforcement and community cooperation. One of her first acts was to establish clear guidelines for compliance monitoring that limited property inspections to once per month unless specific violations were reported and required written notice before any enforcement activity. She also established an appeals process for homeowners who felt they'd been cited unfairly and a mediation program for resolving disputes before they escalated to legal action. Looking back on the whole experience, I'm struck by how quickly a minor violation escalated into a community crisis and how much damage was done to neighborhood relationships over 4 inches of rosebush height. But I'm also struck by how effective collective action can be when homeowners work together to address HOA overreach. Patricia's surveillance campaign might have continued indefinitely if neighbors hadn't been willing to document her activities, share their experiences, and support efforts to establish reasonable boundaries. The media attention was crucial for exposing the absurdity of the situation and building pressure for resolution, but the real change came when board members and community residents decided that harassment wasn't an acceptable enforcement method. I still live in the same house with the same roses at the same height. Patricia moved away 6 months after resigning from the board, selling her house to a young family with 2 small children. The new HOA president sends occasional compliance letters for legitimate violations, but nobody's been measuring plants with rulers or conducting daily surveillance operations. Mrs. Patterson's bird feeder is back up. Jake's potted plants remain on his front porch, and the family on Oak Street's children continue to leave their bicycles in the driveway. Community standards are maintained through reasonable enforcement and neighbor cooperation, not surveillance and intimidation. Sometimes the best way to defend your rights is simply to refuse to surrender them even when the pressure to give in seems overwhelming. This is a dramatized story inspired by common HOA disputes, not legal advice.